Hi everybody. Today I'm doing a video that was originally supposed to be an instructional, like a how-to video, that continues on from some of the previous ones that I did regarding the crossbow kit and more generally how to make inlays out of PVC and plastic, including these lock plates. I've had a lot of questions and a lot of inquiries about how these lock plates are done. So for me, it was quite a mystery as well. I've seen on various people's websites or Facebook posts and social media and so on, a couple of different ways that modern crossbow makers do this. But it wasn't until I saw a photograph in a book, which I talked about in a previous video, and also saw and handled and examined a fragment from the 15th century. Essentially, it was a crossbow tiller, very similar to this one, except all of the inlay pieces are all missing. So you can actually see precisely how these inlay pieces were done, and most importantly, how these lock plates, let's call them, were done. For the more, I guess, normal, let's say, inlay pieces, so these side bits here, the one on the bottom and so on, that's very, very straightforward. And again, you can see that in the previous video that I did, where it's simply a question of getting your material, cutting it to shape, sticking it on, tracing around it with an X-Acto knife, and routing out either with a chisel or, in our case, with an electric router, the space for it, laying it in, gluing it, and then shaving it down so it's flush with the surface. These ones are a lot harder because, as you can see, they go across a curve. So there's a horizontal surface, nearly, that curves down into an almost vertical surface here. The question in my mind when looking at these lock plates and thinking about them really came to a question of form and function, trying to figure out, well, why are these even there? So looking at the fragment that I talked about, there's so little material that's removed for that originally horn lock plate to be installed. Knowing the properties of wood, I just think there's no way that had anything to do with increasing the structural integrity of the crossbow at that particular point. So when you consider the overall structural integrity of a crossbow tiller, like this one, the main thing you want to think about is the forces that this is going to need to withstand while the prod has been spanned and is waiting to shoot rather. As we've discussed in previous videos, the draw weight of crossbows like this one in the 15th century could be enormous. Probably upwards of 1,000 pounds. So if you can imagine 1,000 pounds of pressure that's pulling on the nut here, and it's just sitting there, and it's like 1,000 pounds just sitting on that nut. Well, the nut, because it's round, transfers that weight pulling there into rotational energy, and the trigger fits into that slot and pushes there. So essentially that 1,000 pounds is getting transferred from there and is now pushing on the end of the trigger, which is inside. So what that's doing, it's creating pressure against the axle of the trigger here and the front of the socket here. So it's essentially pulling those two things apart. So wood has pretty good tensile strength. So without bending it, if I just pull straight across, it's very hard. It's not going to break. Now, I don't know whether that little thin piece can withstand 1,000 pounds, but even with thin wood on either side of this the socket here, there's an enormous thick piece of wood all under here. It's very, very thick. So considering trying to pull these two bits apart, there's just no way. Even 1,000 pounds, I just don't think is going to do it. Again, I've got no scientific evidence for this. This is just my own intuition from working with wood and working with crossbows. But of course, very easily you bend it like that and it breaks. So for that reason, that tensile strength of the wood, I just don't think these had anything really to do with strengthening the tiller at that point. I think it's just decorative. And certainly once we get beyond 1500 and we start to see those Renaissance sporting crossbows coming to play that had the steel prods, and again, we're getting above 1,000 pounds of draw weight there. Certainly there was plenty of adornment, well, all over the things, but there was nothing specifically around the nut socket here which you can point to and say, yeah, that strengthens it. It all seems decorative. So that's why I think these are decorative. So in terms of the actual process itself, working on this time went off the rails a little bit because it was a lot harder than I was expecting. So the first time I did this, as you can see, I essentially did lock plates that were simple triangles, which was done at that time. So what that means, though, is that with a simple triangle, you've got a very simple shape. And as long as you know the angle at the bottom of the triangle, and the lines just simply go up, and you know where the triangle is supposed to end, around the top of the tiller, you can almost just have one piece that extends beyond the top, cut it to shape, glue it in, and then shave it down. So the last time I did that with that simple shape, it was quite easy. This shape is significantly more complex, yet not as complex as they would get. That said, it did cause me some serious headaches in trying to fit it in. So I worked through that, and I think I've come up with with a method that will work. So we'll get into that. So essentially what we have left to do is some inlays on the sides. I'm going to do one on the bottom around the hole for the trigger. And then we're also going to do the lock plates, and that's where it gets actually interesting and tricky. And by tricky, I mean infuriating and frustrating. So I'm going to go ahead and continue working on this. I'm not going to really comment much because the side inlays and this bottom one are very similar to what we've already done on the top. And then we'll pick it up with the lock plates. So I've designed these inlay pieces to be exactly centered over the trigger axle hole. So I've marked out a line that's parallel with the top, because the top is my reference surface. So I've marked that out so that this sits exactly vertically over the center of that hole. And then I've also marked the center of that hole on that line. I've marked it as the center of the inlay piece as well. So I'm just going to line everything up like that. Now obviously you'll notice, yes, this is going over that axle hole, and so it's really important when you do one of these, the first thing you do before you flip it over and start inlaying the other piece is you need to drill out that axle hole through this inlay piece before you start on the second inlay piece. So I'll show you how that works in a minute. But for now, we're going to tape this down with double-sided tape. We're going to trace around it with an X-Acto knife, and we're going to take out all the waste. There. Excellente. All right, the glue is now dry. I used epoxy just like the other ones. before I do anything to this in terms of shaving it down or anything like that, we're going to drill through the other side through this axle hole to make sure we've got that axle hole. And in case there's any kind of blowout, when I do that, when we do the final shave down of it, that'll take care of that. So that's why we're not doing it first. So let's do this. One thing that you're going to want to do when you drill these things out is put a block underneath, again, to reduce the chances of anything chipping out on the backside. So the way that I'm doing this with my vise is I'm putting the block on it, lining it up, and then cinching it up, making sure that block is in place behind there. There we go, a nice clean hole on the other side. So now we're ready to, I think, position, mark out, and dig out for the other inlay. Okay, so we've got both the side inlays done, drilled out, and let's put one here. Now for this one, the trick here is to make sure that you know where the slot is for the trigger. So the way that you do that is actually quite simple. All you need to do is mark it out a little further out than when you're actually going to be cutting the inlay, the edges, like that. So I've marked out the very end, the front and the back of the slot for the trigger. And I've marked it out on both sides. So once we've laid in the inlay, that will be completely obscured by the inlay, so we'll need to cut it out. And these marks will tell us exactly where to start cutting and then where to stop cutting. And once we get into the cutting, it'll become very apparent very quickly how wide it is and so on and so forth. But these are pretty critical to ensuring that those first few cuts, that you know exactly where you're supposed to be. So we'll get on with that. Okay, so we're all glued up here, and I know exactly where the opening is underneath because I've marked it out, but we're just going to carry that mark onto the inlay piece. And what we're going to do is just drill to get a hole started. There. Put another one. Good. Now we're going to join up these holes and strike a line. The reason we're putting that line in there is because as we're chiseling, that cut will prevent any of the surface material cracking off beyond where we actually want it to get chiseled away. Put a few more holes in here. You can bring your chisel in and start paring down the sides. And then you can bring in a file. Right, so off camera I smoothed everything down. And I finished cutting out that slot. So now we're ready to do a bit of shaping on this. It's not going to be the final shaping, but what we really want to focus on here is the top part here, we want to round that over near to its final shape, because essentially we're going to use that as a mold for shaping the lock plate pieces that are going to end up going there. So we're going to do that now. We're going to measure out and then shape the round over there. And once that's done, we're going to start heating up some plastic and flattening it and then molding it. So I've got the round overs done on the top so that I can shape it according to that before I start outlining with the X-Acto knife and carving it out. Right, so I've flattened out my plastic and cut it to rough shape, and now as you can see I'm heating it up to make it nice and soft so that I can mold it over that curved surface of the tiller. This is where things started to get problematic. So the first problem here is that the plastic that I'm using is too thick. When it's thick like this, it requires a lot more heat to get soft, which in turn makes it harder to handle and also harder to mold to the shape that you want. That said, once I had it molded to the general curvature that I was looking for, I was able to tape it down, and as you can see, I'm doing the usual method of tracing around with the X-Acto knife to get that shape. And once that's done, I'm going to come in with the chisel to remove the waste. So here I'm just using the chisel to take out the waste. Obviously, because this is a curved surface, I can't use that small Dremel router that I used for the other inlays that were on flat surfaces. So here I'm just simply using a chisel, going around the outline that I already scribed in with the X-Acto knife and deepening that a little bit, and then just taking out waste from the inside. Where these inlays are located, it's going to intersect essentially with the socket for the nut. That's normal to be expected because those horn lock plates are actually going to come snugly right on each side of the nut once everything's complete. So here you can see I'm trying to fit these log pieces in, and they are not fitting. What you're not hearing right now is a great deal of swearing and exasperation. So what did end up working? Well, first and foremost is thinning out that inlay material. So I've got this down to about 1/8 of an inch. And as you can see now, like I've essentially started with a brand new inlay piece, and so essentially I'm fitting the inlay piece to the area that I've carved out, rather than the usual process of finalizing the shape of the inlay piece first and then carving out around it. For this shape, and because of that curvature, I find that carving the space first and fitting the inlay piece to that worked a lot better. And really, it's just a case of rough cutting your inlay piece, heating it up, molding it into place, carving it down a little bit, and basically cycling through that process over and over and gradually refining the shape of the inlay piece until it gets a really nice, snug fit. In my case, there was definitely some gaps that were left. They're pretty easy to deal with when you've got, the miracle of modern epoxy. You can easily cut small pieces of the plastic to fill in any gaps. You can also mix the epoxy with sawdust or even shavings from the plastic itself to fill in any gaps that are there. One thing to keep in mind is that when you've got your inlay piece shaped and fitting in nicely, it may not look very good. The surface of the inlay piece, it just may look really rough and kind of crappy. Don't worry about that, because when you do the final shaving of everything down, filing and sanding, it's going to end up looking pretty nice. So basically what you want to do is just fill in the gap, the space where the inlay is going to go, with epoxy, and just press it into place. And then I've used masking tape here to really tightly bind it in place as a clamp. So now I'm just taking off the tape. I've let that epoxy cure a lot so that it's not soft at all anymore. And then I'm just simply taking down that surface with my spoke shave. After that, I can use a plane, some files, and really gradually take that down so it's nice and continuous with the surface of the tiller overall. And also, it puts a nice finish on the plastic itself. So I wanted to include this bit at the end here, just to show how nicely the plastic actually comes out once you've sanded it down and you're applying the linseed oil. It really ties it all together, and that linseed gets into all the microscopic little scratches from the sandpaper in the plastic, and just smooths everything out and ends up looking pretty nice. Okay, so here we are at the end of our lock plate making journey. You can see the result. After all of the trouble, there's a low spot there. After all the trouble, it actually doesn't look too bad. So, what was supposed to be a how-to video sort of became a bit of a how not to. I feel like I learned a whole bunch doing these ones this time around. So I hope that you can make some sense of this video, and that it can kind of give you at least, if not outright step-by-step how-to, at least it can give you some kind of hints and a direction to take when you're trying to install pseudo horn lock plates.